Time to answer some more comments. So I'm going to start doing this on Fridays where I'll answer comments, new comments on the latest podcast or just my videos in general. And then what I'll do is on the following Tuesday, I will reply to any replies to my comments. And that's what I've done the last week. And that seems to work out. I just am not in a position where I have time to be looking at it every day. So if I respond to one of your comments today, then understand that I'm not going to get back to it if you say something back or reply, I'm not going to get back to it until Tuesday of next week. So on that day, that morning I should probably get around to it, and I'll try to answer as many of those replies as possible. And then if you can comment back, I might be able to reply again. But it's really on those 2 days, Friday and then the following Tuesday, I'll respond to replies. But on Friday, we're going to look at new comments, and we are going to do that in a second. But before I do that, I want to talk about this past podcast. If you can see here on my channel, there were 132 views of the podcast version. So all it is that picture of me, the little thumbnail of Faith Science, and it's just the audio of the podcast. And then here is the video version of the podcast where it's actually me doing something much like this, where I have a Loom video and I am going through it was basically like a Bible study. You hear my nephew in the background, so it was really interesting, all of that. But what the subject was is, if God exists, why is there pain, suffering, and evil in the world? Which is one of the big questions that is often leveled at people who are believers. And so I go in on that podcast and offer a couple of answers that are from the Bible about why there is pain and suffering in the world. Why does evil exist? And the first answer that we talked about was an answer really from the book of Job, where we have an account in which God allows some things to happen to Job that are unfortunate. His health is taken from him, his wealth is taken from him, and all of his children die. And in the end, God never says to him that this was something that he allowed Satan to do to Job. What God does instead is he says, "Who are you to question me?" And that's exactly right. And I know what we talked about this in the podcast, but I know what that must sound like if you're not a believer. How dare God say something like that? But it's actually the exact opposite. How dare we say something to our Creator? How dare we not have the reverence for Him that we should have? And so sometimes God does allow things to happen where there's pain and suffering in our lives, and He has His reasons. In this case, it appears that he knew Job would be able to handle this. He knew that Job would be able to come through and keep his faith. And so he allowed that to happen. There's a scripture in James chapter 1 that says, "Count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience." So the idea there is that people who are believers, when we go through tough times, we don't simply get sad or disappointed or discouraged like most people do, but we understand that when we go through trials, that this is an opportunity for our faith to be tested. And it's really difficult to have your faith grow as far as what the scriptures teach. Your faith is not going to grow unless it is tested, and it's not going to be tested through good times and through easy times. So when there is pain and suffering, it does test our faith and it produces patience in our lives. So that was really the first piece. The second piece is we just went back to Genesis chapters 2 and 3, and we looked at how Adam and Eve in the beginning committed sin. And when sin entered the world, there were all of these ramifications and consequences that occurred as a result. And so the Bible has answers for why we see pain and suffering in the world, why we see hurricanes that destroy things, why we see people who just do evil things, why we see childhood traumas and molestation and various kinds of cancers and diseases. And we say that child didn't do anything to deserve that. And that's true. And so when we look at that and we understand that there's pain and there's suffering that come on us, we understand that God has his reasons, and that much of the pain and suffering is self-inflicted, where there are people in this world who are sinful, that are evil. All of us have things that we do that are wrong. So that's really what we were talking about there on that podcast. So let's go ahead. You can see here there's 48 comments apparently. And so we probably just aren't going to be able to get to everything. So I want to say that too before we get further into the comments. We're not going to get to all of these. So please make thoughtful comments, and and let's just go ahead and get into it. So if you make thoughtful comments, I'm more likely to be able to get to it. Otherwise, if you're just trying to say something insulting or whatever the case may be, then that is where we'll be able to answer your question more quickly, rather than and one of the things I want to talk about is that we really do want to try to find people who are truly seeking, rather than just simply people that are just like mad and angry at God, because that's the case as well. But people who are truly seeking will find will be found by God, and we will be able to show evidence for the existence of God and for the inspiration of the Bible, for instance. So there are a lot of these kinds of science does not say, it says, okay, so Mr. Rebound from 6 days ago says science does not say that the universe came from nothing. It says we don't know where it came from. It says there are reasons to assume that there was a Big Bang, more like a rapid expansion, and we do not know what was before that. This is fundamentally different from what you assert. Please, believers, stop painting straw men to fit your narrative. I understand why it seems like a straw man, but the point is, if physicists, so let's answer this. If physicists are saying that there was no space, time, energy, or matter prior to the Big Bang, that seems to be the prevailing wisdom. If there was no space, time, energy, or matter prior to the Big Bang, then what was there? I'm not trying to paint a straw man, but my understanding is that there was no space, time, energy, or matter prior to the Big Bang. Is that incorrect? Like, we can, why don't we like look up let's say before the Big Bang? Um what was before what existed before the Big Bang? There's something called initial singularity here. But again, this idea of an initial singularity here just says that basically this is the idea that there was maybe a singularity, which means basically this really tiny point of infinite density. So I I know that it sounds like there's a straw man here, but what is it then? So the difficulty here is, what you're saying is we don't know what was before that. And it seems that there are people that say there was no space time. Like, if that isn't what it is, I'm not trying to paint a straw man, but you're not giving me what there was. Right? That's the difficulty here. So I don't mean to. So my understanding is that there was no space, time, energy, or matter prior to the Big Bang. Is that like my understanding is that that's the popular view. And so, isn't that the same as, I don't mean for, like, I literally don't mean for there to be a straw man. But what happens is, what you're arguing against is, you're saying, I'm not saying there was nothing. I'm saying I don't know what it was. And I don't, and so I'm not saying that's convenient, but I don't know what to do with that. It's because if there's no space, time, energy, or matter, if those came into existence at the Big Bang, so again, it's like, well, it's more like a rapid expansion. Okay, but what do we is that according to let's and what's difficult about it, all of this is that all of this is saying science doesn't say that. Well, science, I don't consider Big Bang science. So that's the issue, and that's what's so convenient here, because you can say that this is science, but then when I ask, well, what does it say, and it's like, well, it doesn't say anything. So we don't have anything we can nail down here. So if you say, well, we don't know what was before that, but again, my understanding is that the physicists say that there was no space, time, energy, or matter prior to the Big Bang. And if that's true, then that's the same as saying there was nothing. And if you say that you don't know what was before that, you don't know that it wasn't nothing. That's the other piece to this. You can't exclude nothing from the possibility. You're saying, well, I'm not saying it's nothing. You're also not saying it's not, but you kind of are saying it's not, but you don't know what it was. So the difficulty here is if I tell you God has always existed, he is eternal, and he made the heavens and the earth, he made the universe, and you say, well, I don't like that explanation, but then I ask you for your explanation, and your explanation is, well, I don't know what there was before this rapid expansion. And in fact, when you start looking at the aspects of a rapid expansion, and even going back to like an initial singularity, you start running into all kinds of physics problems. So was there space, time, energy, or matter prior to the Big Bang? Because my understanding is there not. Is there was not. According, because again, I'm talking about the Big Bang model, and the difficulty here is that the Big Bang model, it's not just one model. And so I'll say this about the Big Bang, and people say that's not what the Big Bang is. And I go, okay, who do we go to figure out what the Big Bang is? That's why we can't really. That's why you can't call this science. It's a model. It's a hypothesis. But the but because we can't nail it down, then everybody can come and they can say, oh well, that's just a straw man. What I would say here is, I'm trying to figure out what I would say here, because are you saying that space, time, energy, and matter existed prior to the Big Bang? But I don't believe that there was a Big Bang, so I can't even ask it like that, because I'm saying according to this model that you're using, according to this hypothesis. Now, people don't like me calling it a hypothesis, but I mean that's at best what you would have to call it. I mean it's a model. It's maybe a hypothesis. To call it a theory is certainly premature by any kind of physics standards. And what you begin to have is there are increasing numbers of people who actually don't even believe, for example, in an initial singularity. This is a good comment though. That's the thing. I appreciate the comment where you're saying, well, you're straw manning the argument. And my thing is, okay, so what I could do instead is I could say that you're saying that there was a big bang, or there was a rapid expansion of what at the beginning. So this is the difficulty. So I'm saying either way, we're talking about to really try to answer what Mr. Rebound is talking about here. Basically, what I've been saying is you have to believe in God or you believe in Bay, which is both of which are supernatural. If you believe in a creator who made the heavens and the earth and set natural laws in motion, he established these natural laws that didn't exist prior to this, and we have the world that we have. And so he created uh, things as he describes in Genesis chapters 1 and 2. You can believe that, Or you can believe what is called science, but it's not really science because none of it is observable and it's all supernatural. Big Bang, abiogenesis, and evolution. And when I say evolution here, I mean macroevolution. Big Bang, what I've been calling Big Bang, is an explosion from nothing to something. Now, people say, well, that's disingenuous to say that. It's a straw man. Okay. My understanding is that space, time, energy, matter did not exist prior to the Big Bang. Are you saying that it did? According to this model. I'm trying to explain the model. But let's say, okay, it did. There was an initial singularity, this really tiny dot of infinitely dense, uh, it's infinitely dense energy ball, basically. There are many questions here. Where'd that come from? But not to like, if we just say, well, we don't know where that came from, because as far as we can tell, matter and energy are not eternal. So they had to come from somewhere. And so if we go back to an initial singularity, aren't we ultimately saying that because matter and energy are not eternal, that if you take everything back to a really small dot of infinite density, that going back farther is, well, there was nothing there and then there was that dot. I don't know how else you say it, because if we're pretty clear that matter and energy aren't eternal, then you don't just kind of go back in an infinite regress. There comes a point where there was no matter and where there was no energy. And so doesn't that mean there was nothing first? Now maybe not. Maybe you're saying something else, but it's very difficult to nail down. And so then when you try to say, well, what was it then? It's like, well, we don't know what it was. But the problem with that is that means you don't know it was nothing. You don't know it wasn't nothing. So I don't know how you argue against it because you don't know whether it was nothing or not. So, according to the Big Bang hypothesis, did space, time, energy, or matter exist prior to the Big Bang? My understanding is that none of those existed. But that's the same as saying that nothing existed. The other thing is that if you don't know what was before that, you don't know that it wasn't nothing. I mean, that it wasn't nothing. I don't know if I'll end up saying that or not in the comment, but I mean, that's really what it comes down to here. If you say you don't know what was there, because that's been a common comment, that we don't know what was there prior to the Big Bang, then that also means you don't know it wasn't nothing. Or are you saying it? Are you saying there really was something? We just don't know what it was. I guess that's possible, but my understanding is, as far as we can tell, matter and energy aren't eternal. So there must have been a point at which there was no matter and energy. Otherwise, you are advocating, you're suggesting eternal matter or energy. So that last part about you can't, you don't know what, if you don't know what was before that, you can't say it wasn't nothing. I think it's true though. But in this case, I'm really trying to get at, you're saying I'm making a straw man, but it's not really a straw man because, how do I say this? It's already a straw man because you're saying you don't know. But then coming against people who are saying God made these things, and you're saying this explanation is better. This explanation where there was an initial singularity of infinite density. Where'd that come from? I don't know. And you say, well, but that's real science. Is it? Because all of that is a model. It's all a hypothesis. And what happens before the initial singularity? Isn't that isn't the idea of an initial singularity um prior to the initial singularity there wasn't anything. So I do not mean to build a strong man here. According to the Big Bang hypothesis, did space-time, energy, or matter exist prior to the initial singularity? My understanding is that none of those existed, but that's the same as saying that nothing existed. So, as far as we can tell, matter and energy aren't eternal. So, there must have been a point at which there was no matter and energy. Otherwise, you're suggesting eternal matter and energy. So that's all. That would be my response here. I don't know what else to. I don't know how else I would say that. You're saying that it's okay. So yeah. So science can explain evil deeds and suffering. It's exactly what you would expect. We'll get to that one in a second. Genesis claims fruit trees existed before the sun existed. Yes, Genesis 1:11. We can look it up. The best explanation for this is that it is man made mythology created by scientifically ignorant humans making their best guess and failing. If you start with the presupposition that the Bible is the infallible word of God, you are forced into the position of having indefensible. Since you cannot admit error in the Bible, you are forced into apologetics, the dishonest practice of defending that which cannot be defended. I want to get this straight. What is I don't even understand why fruit trees existing before the sun existed is a problem. Like I honestly don't know what the problem is. So, for example, let's say that there is darkness for 2 days, no sun for 2 days. Do all the trees cease to exist? No. So, if God made trees, and we can go to the text by the way if you want to, but um, if God made trees in Genesis chapter 1 on the third day, and then the sun is made on the fourth day. Now, by the way, light has already, so that the person maybe is not talking about that. But there is grass. The vegetation is made on day 3, which is correct, and then on day 4, that's when the sun is made. So all of that's correct. So the thing is, you're saying something is dishonest, but the problem is there there's nothing contradictory about that. And so I'm always curious about, you're talking about presuppositions and assumptions that are made. If God makes trees on day 3, um light existed on day 1, trees were made on day 3, the sun was made on day 4. I don't see what the problem is. I honestly don't see what the problem is here. And so the best explanation for this, well, you're making some kind of I think the issue here is you're making some kind of assumption that trees must have um, come about. They would have needed, again, years of sun or that type of thing. Um, that's the only thing I can think of is that I can't see what the assumptions are that you're making that and so what happens is if you start with the presupposition that the Bible is the infallible word of God, you're forced into the position of having to defend the indefensible. Okay. And this is what I get at when I'm talking about this stuff down here about Big Bang, abiogenesis, and evolution. Those are indefensible. and and then you claim that then there are people that claim that they're naturalistic. So light already existed on day one. Trees were made on day three. The sun was made on day four. I honestly don't see what the I know that there's some kind of assumption that you're making that I'm not making, and because you have these assumptions that I can't see, so you have some hidden assumptions that are making you struggle with this. And I think the other piece to this is we're talking about we are clearly talking about something that's supernatural. Like there's no question about it. So I don't I understand how you might say, oh well, how could trees exist prior to the sun? But you're saying that because you're thinking that trees had to come about from some naturalistic process. Um, so it's probably some kind of naturalistic assumption that you're making. You're probably making the assumption that trees came to. Now, again, there's this entire when you think about how plants work in the world, how as humans we breathe out carbon dioxide, which is precisely what trees need, and then they output oxygen, which is what we need. And people say, well, it's just great that it worked out like that. That's it. I mean, I that's what people go with. That it's just so great that it just worked out that way. All randomly. There was no direction in all of this. That and so that's the same thing that's happening here. That this wasn't built. And so, I, if I can use another analogy here, if you think about a car, and you think about all of the design that goes into a car. My brother is an engineer for General Motors, so he could probably go into more detail about that than me. I'm a robotics engineer, so we could talk about robot, but I think we are more familiar with cars. If you have a car, and we look at the way a car drives, we look at the way it maneuvers, and imagine that we came up with some kind of thought that the car came to exist in some kind of way that didn't involve people making it. Because that's really what's happening here. You're assuming that someone didn't make trees and then set the natural order in motion. That's what God did. But before there were any trees, somebody had to make them. And so when we're talking about the process of making them, you're relying on, so for example, if someone says, "Well, how could you make a car? It didn't have any gas in it." And you go, "No, when you're initially making the car, no, it doesn't have gas in the tank already." And so if someone was describing a car being manufactured and then said, "Oh, and there's no gas inside," no one would think twice about that, because what we're talking about is we're manufacturing this car, and then it goes out on the road and someone operates it and puts oil in it and does all of the things that people do with cars. But we don't look at the operation of car now and then somehow impose how it would have been manufactured and say, well, it couldn't have been manufactured in this way where it didn't have any gas in it because cars have to have gas in them. And what you're saying here is the that trees couldn't have existed for a day prior to the sun being there because trees now must have sunlight. I'm with you. Trees now must have sunlight. But if you then extrapolate backwards and say that when trees were initially being manufactured by God Himself, that there had to have been sun existing during the manufacturing process, that's just like saying you had to have gas in the tank of a car while it's being manufactured. No, you don't. Just because you need that after the fact doesn't mean you need that during the manufacturing, during the creation process. So during the creation week, no, you don't have to have the sun be there, just like you do after God has put everything in place. So that would be the answer there. So there's a hidden assumption here, and I encounter these kinds of things often. So if you're someone who is saying, who then just begins to talk about you're having to defend the indefensible, understand I'm not using the same presuppositions that you're using. And because I'm not, then you are immediately attacking and saying someone has to be dishonest. You don't have to be dishonest. The issue is I don't have your same presuppositions. And when we peel back the presuppositions that you're putting in here without saying them, see notice there's nothing said here. Genesis claims fruit trees existed before the sun existed. Yes. Now, you say the best explanation for this is that it's man-made mythology. So you've already said you're in your head when you make that when you say that sentence, you're immediately saying that that is a ridiculous thought. And so that's the issue. What's ridiculous about it? Well, you might say, how could trees exist prior to the sun? Now, that's a good question. But that's not but you never asked that question. You're already presupposing that you know the answer, that it could not happen. And I'm saying, of course it could happen. In fact, first of all, there was light already. So light already existed. So if your problem is there couldn't have been light, that you couldn't have had trees for a day without light, there was already light. So I don't it's so I'm trying to there I think there is hidden assumptions are causing you to struggle with seeing how this would work. Light already existed on day one. Trees were made on day two. The sun was created on day four. There's no there's no problem here. I think what you would probably say is because the sun is needed for trees now, then you couldn't have gone a day without sun at the very beginning. Would be the would be I guess the idea. But again, you couldn't go a day without sun. I mean, even if I think about even now, can a plant survive for a day without sun? Of course it can. If a tree doesn't have sun for a single day, does that mean up it ceases to exist? No. So even if we ignore the fact that there was light already on day one, are we really saying that trees made on day three without light for the rest of that day, they're going to be dead by day four, and then the sun comes, and then we're all toast? I don't think so. I think we're okay. Uh, so that's what I would say. I would say that there are hidden assumptions there. Um, if a good God exists, why are children born with deadly disease? Um, Science can explain evil deeds and suffering, but science, but that's just it. Um, um, Science can't explain suffering. So again, it's like this. It's exactly what you would expect in a completely natural world. No, not evil. Science has nothing to say about evil. So I mean, science has no, again, science doesn't speak on evil or good. So to say that you would expect evil, no, you can't, like, because there is no evil or good in science. So it can't explain evil, right? There's no explanation, right? Evil and good are moral concepts. So how would science, what does science have to say about evil and good? So I would just ask that question. Evil and good are moral concepts. So how does science explain evil? You say that is what we would expect. Again, this is the thing. There's a materialism there that's there. No, if a good God exists, why are children born with deadly disease? We talk a little bit about that in the video, so that's what I would say. If that's the same word the devil used to tempt Jesus with in the wilderness, if, okay, that's probably a response to someone else. God doesn't. Yeah, I don't know what that is. Um, if there is an all-loving God, why is there suffering at all? And so this is good. Um, this is the ultimate question that we're asking. And the point is, there's an assumption, there's an underlying assumption when you ask about suffering, the existence of suffering. And the assumption is this: there shouldn't be any. That the world would be better if there wasn't any suffering. And one of the things we talk about in the video is, honestly, sometimes it is when we come out of suffering that we just feel and experience the greatest faith, certainly for believers. But even if you're not a believer, how often have you gone through something that was painful, something that was difficult, and on the other side you are a better person in however you want to define being better, that you were a better person on the other side? How often has that happened in your life? That you went through some kind of pain, you went through some kind of suffering, and you made it through to the other side, and you were better. You say, well, why would a good, an all loving God allow that? The assumption you're making is that there isn't good that can come from suffering. And the scriptures teach that there is. And I think even in your own experience, you will see that. So I would say here, the assumption made here is that suffering is bad, is always bad. Bible teaches that there are lessons to be learned from suffering. Often, because all suffering isn't that. All suffering is always that suffering is always bad. The Bible teaches that there are often um, great lessons to be learned from pain and suffering. Often, there are things that we can only learn through suffering. Surely, you've experienced suffering in your own life that you can be thankful for. I want to say that as a question. Haven't you experienced pain or suffering in your life, in your own life, that you can look back on and be thankful for. And I think that is the thing. There is sometimes a short-sighted nature to how we view pain and suffering. No, God, an all-loving God would not allow this to happen. Right? And I'm saying the assumption made here is that suffering is always bad. The Bible teaches that there are often great lessons to be learned from pain and suffering. Often there are things that we can only learn through suffering. Haven't you experienced pain or suffering in your own life that you can look back on and be thankful for? I mean, I know I can. I don't want to necessarily do story time right now, but I just finished my PhD in mechanical engineering back in December. And it took me a long time to get finished with it. And there were times where I just wasn't sure that I was ever going to get finished. And anybody who's ever been in graduate school, certainly graduate school in engineering, you've been there. People don't want to publish your work, or you get in there and you have a committee member that doesn't want to be on your committee anymore, and now you have to go, scramble, and so there's just all kinds of things that come up in graduate school. Not to mention that again, I was in graduate school. Uh, I was wanting to really try to not go out and work somewhere full time so that I could finish faster. End up really not mattering. I got so unfocused that I would have been fine going out and working somewhere. But in the end, you're kind of a broke graduate school student, just kind of sitting around saying, what am I doing here? Do I really want to get this finished? And you start having all these doubts. And I tell you, when I got that thing finished, when I got through my dissertation defense back in just a little over a year ago, actually, back in October of last year, and then I got my dissertation approved by my committee. I mean, last second, I was right there. I think it had to be done. Everything had to be in by a Wednesday, and my committee approved it on a Monday. And got everything in, and I knew I was going to graduate in December. Just all of what I went through, all of, again, let's call it pain and suffering, not like, some kind of disease or anything like that, but we can apply this to anything. All of that, all of a sudden, was instructive. And it taught me about faith. It taught me about believing in what I was doing and believing in myself and knowing that I can push through the obstacles until I get through. Surely, John Hammond, you've had times like that. And you can't believe more. Again, let's not even talk about, like, for you, let's say you're not a believer in God, but certainly when it comes to confidence in yourself, no one has great confidence in themselves and they haven't gone through something. And so if you have any confidence in yourself, it's because you've gone through some stuff. And if you never had to go through anything, and because God loved us, and it's this very shallow type of love that I think people are generally referring to here, that this shallow type of love where God just doesn't let anything bad happen to me. If he was really all loving God, he just not let anything happen to me. And the thing is, the confidence that I have right now, I couldn't have had if I hadn't gone through that ordeal. And fill in the blank with all other kinds of things. If you've ever gone through a health scare or a health issue, if you've ever had a death in your family and you had to step up, there are all kinds of things like that we go through, that we come out of it stronger. And you can't get stronger without those things. And this is one of the things that the Bible says. So would God really be an all-loving God if he didn't allow you to go through things that made you stronger? So actually, I like that as a final question. Because I like it. I like the question, because this is a common question that people have. And there are people like, yeah, but would he really be an all loving God if he withheld the pain that would make you a better person? Would he? And I think the answer to that ultimately is no. He would not be all loving. If I can be better, if I can be greater, if I can be more, and if that's what he calls for me to be, by the way, then no, he wants me to see that. And so suffering's not always bad. The Bible teaches that there are often great lessons to be learned from pain and suffering. And there are things that we can only learn through suffering. Okay. Yes, the two are diametrically and irreconcilably um like faith is nothing more than the synthesis of the deepest possible ignorance and arrogance. I mean, all due respect, that's an arrogant statement, right? Like, do you understand that when you speak like that, you speak with arrogance, and then you say that the person of faith is arrogant? So my thing is, we defined what faith was and we defined what science was. So I'm sure that all the person did was read the title, and maybe not, but I'm pretty sure the person just read the title, went down and said, all faith is the synthesis of the deepest possible ignorance and arrogance, which is an arrogant thing to say. It's an oxymoron. Luckily for us, gods only exist in the imagination. Somebody says, what if the imagination is a real realm where thoughts create reality? Someone said, what if pigs could fly? Go on, answer. Then they would be flying. My comment was actually relevant to what you said, though. I thought it would be a fun thing to think about with a fellow peer. Guess not. So, what's interesting is a person who's willing to concede that potentially reality, there could be a realm in which reality is created by thoughts or by, let's say, words, is willing to also concede that the world that we experience is one that is made by the word of God, that it is his concept, it is his reality that he has made, and we are living in it. So, um, uh, my thing is, this person says gods only exist in the imagination. I would just say, do I want to comment? I've got a bunch of comments to get to. I'm going to have to skip that one, but we'll keep going. Science and faith are two opposing positions, and no, I have no faith, and you are a wrong and trying to conflate religious faith and the common usage like a think it might rain tonight is dishonest. The Bible says faith is the evidence. Now, since we have 100 common religions, do you think their faith is true? So I'm it shows up in my feed and I don't know how to block it. I would say this, if you're trying to get banned, you probably shouldn't comment because that, like, the algorithm sees that. So um if it's possible to get banned, you probably shouldn't have commented. That may make it worse for you. I that's really interesting for somebody to say, "Can I get banned?" Because I'm getting it shows up in my feed and I don't know how to block it. It's like, you can just not click on it. um Like, that's really interesting. Somebody's like, it's showing up in my feed. So I clicked on the video. I went down and commented on the video. Huh. That so again, my thing is I see stuff like you just don't I never click on the stuff, right? Like I don't know what it is. So um yeah, I don't know what to say here to bad atheist here. I kind of want to answer, but wants us to, apparently the algorithm wants us to love imaginary people. I don't. Yeah, okay. I think he's referring to God here, but what's funny is you're clicking on the video. So again, it seems you probably shouldn't have clicked on the video. Hopefully that doesn't make it worse for you. Cuz I mean, if if you if you're trying to avoid my videos, you probably shouldn't have clicked on it. I'm just going to say here, if you're trying to avoid me, you probably shouldn't have clicked on my video and you certainly shouldn't have commented. Hopefully that doesn't make it worse for you. Because I mean, I don't know what to say to something like that. Somebody comments on your video that they had to click on to see, and they say, "Can I get banned from your channel?" There is a way to say "Don't recommend channel," by the way. And if you go to "Don't recommend channel," it will. So, like, if you go, um, maybe you're going to watch this, maybe not. But if you go to "Don't," there's a way to click on a video. Here, I'll actually show you. Let's go to leave this open, but let's go to a different. Let's go to YouTube. This might help somebody out. If you honestly are just not wanting to, well, there's stuff on here that I don't want to see something with Glorilla on there. But I look at some of Nick Jones's stuff. Um, I let's. I'm trying to see if I. Okay, so let's look at this. This says the Bible was a black book. Let's say I don't know anything about this creator, um, but I'm just going to do this as a. Well, let's just do this from the Equalizer because I know I don't watch anything like that. So let's say I want to not see anything from this particular channel anymore. And I only have one channel, by the way. So if you block my channel, then you won't have to see me anymore. What I would do is I would go to these three dots right here. I would click here and go to "Don't recommend channel," and you shouldn't see it in your feed anymore. You can also go to "Not interested." So go to "Not interested" or "Don't recommend channel," and that is a way for you to not have to see me anymore. But I will maybe link this part of the video to this particular. Well, I probably won't. They'll be able to find it. I don't want to go back through and find it. So there was that. This one wasn't. The Bible says faith is the evidence. You're referring to Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1. Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And I'm not conflating anything. This is the point I'm making, right? What happens is, well, you're trying to conflate religious faith and the common usage. What I'm saying is the common usage is the same. The difference is in what the faith is in. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to say that there's a difference between religious faith, trust, confidence, belief, and faith, trust, confidence, belief in other things. And I'm saying that that's not the case. And what happens is when I say that, you say, well, you're conflating things. I'm not conflating things. We all believe in things. I have no faith. Yes, you do. There are things that you believe in. There are people that you believe in. And so, since there are things and people that you believe in, the issue here is there are things and people that I believe in, But what you're saying is, well, I believe in some things that are in a different category of belief, but everybody believes in things. And everybody believes in things that you can't nail down with some kind of scientific accuracy why you believe in it. So I always like to talk about three particular things. I like, well, a couple of particular things. One of the things I like to talk about is, for instance, how a person who is married believes in the faithfulness of their spouse. That is not a thing that you go around and follow them around with a camera to make sure they're faithful. You just don't do that. You don't send a private investigator around after your wife. Why? Because you believe she's faithful. Now, I could have somebody that says, I don't believe that your wife is faithful. And okay, so and so it's not something that you have nailed down with some kind of scientific accuracy. And faith in God is very similar to this. What you're wanting me to do is you're wanting me to say that faith in God is this different kind of thing, but it's not a different kind of thing. There's a sense in which he is a certainly greater than believing in your wife's faithfulness, or it's greater than believing in something, let's say, your own ability to reason. That's another example. You believe that you have reasoning capability. Okay. But if somebody says, no, you're crazy. And if everybody said, no, 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 you're crazy, do you just go along with it? And what would you do to show somebody that you're not crazy? You believe that. But there's nothing scientific that you nail it down with. But there is evidence that you can look at and say, hey, this is why I believe I'm not crazy. This is why I believe my wife is faithful. And so that's what we do on this channel. We point out this. There's a podcast coming out this coming Sunday. You should check it out. I talk with Craig D. Hutt of one of the co-founders of Appian Media, and they do professionally done, freely accessible, accurate Bible media. And so their most recent project is called Out of Egypt, and they go over to Egypt and to Jordan, and they look at a lot of the artifacts and evidence that Moses did indeed lead the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt, as is described in the book of Exodus. Those of you that say that the Bible is full of fairy tales, the Bible doesn't read like a fairy tale. It includes historical facts. It includes information that can be corroborated. Now, again, yes, we believe in it. And no, I don't need another archaeological find, just like a man doesn't need you to confirm to him that his wife is faithful. He already knows his wife is faithful. And so if you say, well, you know what, your wife went straight home from work the other day. Okay. He didn't need to hear that to know that his wife was faithful. I don't need to hear another archaeological find that corroborates something from the scriptures to know that the scriptures are faithful. But hopefully that's helpful to some of you, because some of you are saying things like there is no evidence. No evidence? That's a wild statement to say there's no evidence. Like, as much as I rag on Big Bang, abiogenesis, and macroevolution, I go in on those quite a bit. I don't say something like there's no evidence for it. Right? What I'm saying is what the evidence that people present for it is either misinterpreted or misunderstood. But to say there's none is, I'm not going to insult you like that. Again, I don't believe any of that stuff ever happened. But I'm not going to insult you and say that there's no evidence. I would say, hey, show me the evidence that you have. But what happens instead is that people don't say, hey, what's your best? Why don't you give me your best shot? Like, what is the thing that you would point to? And there are several things we could. Like, that's the thing about it for those of us who are believers and who study this stuff. It's something somebody said here earlier, that if you're in apologetics, you're just going around being dishonest and lying. It's exactly the opposite. We see all of these people that are saying things against our God and against the Bible, And we see all of this evidence out here. And we're trying to get you to see it. And so some of you are taking a look at this, and we're thankful for that on the channel. So let's go ahead and go up here. Religions use traditions to try to explain things. Scientific research seeks to investigate things. Explanation is not a primary issue in scientific thinking, and many people are not necessarily able to understand scientific explanations. In science, observations are not interpreted as matching wishes. Rather, religions explain everything, and therefore a person about things in more detail when they only become more complicated and unbelievable by thinking critically, as the number of religions and beliefs shows. This was a thought exactly how to respond to it exactly. What I would say here is what the person seems to be saying is that he's not religious, and that the fact that there are many religions means there, let's put it this way, because I would agree that there are many false religions. Obviously, I believe there's only one true religion, and there are many false ones. And in fact, even within Christianity, let's say, there are many false Christians or many false believers, people who claim to be believers, and then but they're not really looking what, if you compare what they're doing to the scriptures, it doesn't look like that. So I completely understand, and this is what makes all of this somewhat difficult for someone like me, is that when you lump me in with all of these other religious people. Now the problem I have is you don't want me lumping you in with all of the atheists, like Hitler and Stalin and Pol Pot. Like, you don't really want me to lump you in with the people who take atheism to its logical conclusion, which is everything is subjective. I do what I want. If we take everything to its logical conclusion, that's where you get to, that I do what I want. So to lump me in with everybody else, lump the Christian in with all of these false religions that are made up, is just like lumping you in with all of these people who have done numerous atrocities, and they did it because they didn't believe in God, and they felt like they were in a position to say and do whatever they wanted to with with impunity. Because if there's no God, then someone who is a dictator or a tyrant can do as they please. But if there is a God, then they will be punished. They will be dealt with. And so the issue that you have here is scientific research seeks to investigate things. Who came up with scientific research? Who came up with modern science? Believers did. So this idea of investigating things, it's not clear at all why you should want to investigate things if you believe that everything came about through random processes. But if you believe that there is a God that made all of this, then it makes perfect sense why you want to investigate these things, why you want to see, how did God do this? And so the idea is that religions explain everything. I mean, I don't know what that means, right? And so maybe there are false religions out here that do that. But when you lump Christianity in with the false religions, I just kind of go, if heaven is perfect, how did we end up with fallen angels? And how was Satan able to rebel in the first place? Flawed stories written by flawed men. So again, like, it's a legitimate question, but I mean, I don't know, when we say heaven is perfect, I'm whenever we're talking about falling, people that fall and rebel, what you're wanting, it appears, is for God to create robots. And God could have. And so, but he did not. But that's what you seem to want. You want him to create robots, and God does not appear to be interested in robots. So God is perfect. But he apparently isn't interested in building robots. He has given humans, for example, he has given humans free will. which we have often used in ways that are against his will. But thankfully, through Jesus Christ, we have the opportunity to live lives that are upright before God. Okay? So I would say instead, the question about the fallen angels and Satan being able to rebel is this idea that, well, if God's perfect, how are all these able to do that? Well, and there's an inherent assumption here. You're assuming that God should have done it a different way, right? There's this assumption in it sounds like you're assuming something like, I would have done it differently if I were God. There was someone earlier that said something about ignorance and arrogance. I don't want to say ignorance per se here, although there's probably some of that, but because we all have some ignorance. But arrogance is the thing that is so common in these discussions of God that I'd like to point out that it is extremely arrogant to say, well, what God should have done is this. And so I don't want to say, hey, you're being arrogant, DAGG 310. But what I would say is, God knows everything and we don't. So it's very difficult to say that. God knows everything. We don't. So so it doesn't make sense for us to say something like, if I were God, I would have done it differently. God's perfect. He isn't interested in building robots that do exactly what he commands. Instead, he has given humans free will that he wants us to use to serve him. But we have often used our free will in ways that are against what he wants. Okay. So the person asks again, if heaven is perfect, how do we end up with fallen angels, and how was Satan able to rebel in the first place? And again, frankly, that's a long story. Now somebody says, well, exactly, like, got him. And well, no, it's potentially the start of a good conversation. But what I would say is God knows everything. So one of the things you're doing here is you're assuming you're on the same level as him, and you're not. So it doesn't make uh, any sense for us to say, well, this is how I would have done it, which is essentially what you're doing. Well, how did he let that happen? And so because he's perfect, he's not, he can do it as he pleases. And he apparently doesn't want to build robots that do exactly what he commands. Instead, he has given humans free will that he wants us to use to serve him. But we have often used our free will in ways that oppose God. Thankfully, through Jesus Christ, we have the opportunity to live lives that are upright before him. That's pretty good, I guess. Uh, Moses, dude, why would a modern person take Moses as a historical person? Um, which miracles were witnessed by writers of the Bible? So, all right. And my question would be, why wouldn't they? Because this is precisely what happens throughout history. There are people that throughout history have said, hey, you don't really believe David existed, do you? People were saying the same thing about David a few years ago. Then they found something about David. People are saying this about Moses. And then they're going to find something about Moses, right? That's the thing that's going to happen. And then what happens is 20 years from now, people aren't saying this anymore. They're going to find someone else. People do this with all kinds of people in the scriptures. Over and over and over again, skeptics have questioned different people's existence in the Bible. David is one of the more recent ones that not that long ago, someone found found archaeological historical evidence. Oh, David was real, and so this is where um, I might point you to someone else, or point you to Appian Media. They have a series. Believe it's Searching for King David. I think it's something like that under the Appian Media YouTube channel. If you check that out, you'll see that they go into that, and talk about the fact that David was a historical figure. And this happens all the time. People said very similar things about, people have said very, um, let me say skeptics. Many people in the Bible, like Pontius Pilate, David, well, even Jesus. There are people that have even questioned the existence of Jesus, and nobody really questions those anymore because the historical and archaeological evidence has piled up. And then you just have to say, okay, he was real, but what about Moses? And that's basically where we are now. Is that skeptics will just move the goalpost. Um, then once they've had these questions, but then after the historical or archaeological evidence is found that removes all doubt, as to the existence of these people. So what I would say to you is, if we look at that, there there's nobody named Pontius Pilate, then we find it. There's nobody King David, that's just a fairy tale. Then we find archaeological evidence that's referring to David. In fact, the archaeological evidence referring to some of the archaeological evidence referring to David, what happens is you have a king that lived after the time of David. And there's another king saying, I defeated this king that was of the house of David. Now, notice, if you're just going to say, I defeated this king over here, that would be one thing. But part of what he's saying is, I defeated this king that was from the lineage or the household of David, which makes David a significant king in the realm or in the area, because that means we're pointing out that we defeated this king of Israel, or this king of Judah in this case, that was from that. from the lineage of David. So he came from that. So when we find that kind of thing, it actually doesn't just tell us that David existed. It also tells us that David was someone who is recognized as a significant enough figure that later generations of kings after him are still referred to as of the house of David, which actually is a term that's in scripture as well. So you have these terms that are in scripture, and then we go to archaeology and we see that term over there. And we're just finding these things out in the 20th and 21st centuries. And the scriptures, in the case, the scriptures that are talking about David are nearly 3,000 years old. So this is the thing that we're saying here. When there are people that say this over and over again, there have been similar questions in the past about many people in the Bible, like Pontius Pilate, David, and even Jesus. Then historical and archaeological evidence is found that removes all doubt as to the existence of these people. Then skeptics move on to someone else, like Moses. And so hopefully you will take a look at, like, if you want me to do something like that. But the idea of saying that why would a modern person take Moses as a historical person reflects the fact that you think that there is this, whoa, we know that Moses wasn't real. Do you know that? So that's what I would say. Which miracles were witnessed by writers of the Bible? Again, if we're looking at the Gospels, Matthew would have been an eyewitness of the miracles of Jesus. John would have been a witness of miracles of Jesus. And again, just because all of the writers of scripture weren't necessarily witnesses to everything that they wrote about, which again is also true in modern times. How many reporters were actually witnesses to, like, let's say, eyewitnesses to the things that they're reporting on, right? Does a reporter have to be there, or can a reporter talk to eyewitnesses? Of course, a reporter can talk to eyewitnesses. And so this is what we see with Luke, for instance. Luke, he went out and found eyewitnesses, and he gathered testimony, he gathered information, and he put that together in a document that is just really precise. And so we have that. So was Luke walking around with Jesus? No. Was he walking around with Paul? Yes. And we see that in Luke's writings. We see him switch to not just saying Paul did this and they did that, but he'll start saying we later in the book of Acts, where he is actually there. He is part of the party. But everything wasn't him being an eyewitness, but he talked to people who were eyewitnesses. So I can think about Matthew and John would have been Matthew and John as apostles of Jesus. Eyewitnesses of the miracles they wrote about, particularly the resurrection of Christ. So Matthew and John, as apostles of Jesus, would have been eyewitnesses of the miracles they wrote about in their gospel accounts. Particularly the resurrection of Christ. Okay. So there is one person. The difference between an axiom in science and an axiom in religion are so vast that comparisons between the two are laughable. A mechanical engineer, I'm curious what your thoughts on the heat problem are. What heat problem? If that's true, why don't they happen now? If it was to show that the words form the speakers were true, then why don't faith healers actually work? Moses didn't give information to the Egyptians, but he also didn't exist. And that convinces you of it. So again, I'm an atheist. What do you want on your podcast? Also a former young earth creationist, because the Vienna Circle proposed decoupling of metaphysics from formal scientific investigation as they favored logical positivism. Dogma teaches that God is all of those things. Bible does not teach that. The The Bible does not teach the Bible is all of those things. God is all powerful unless your enemy has iron chariots. He is all knowing unless he needs to physically get up and go to a city to see if it really is as bad as everyone says. God is all good unless, do you really need an example of God doing evil? How about where he creates it? Isaiah 45, verse 7. Um, and then he kind of replies to his own stuff. So this is really interesting. I mean, I what I would say here is, um, now I would have to go back and like look at, again, I would have to come in here and go, because he put these timestamps in here, and I need to go back and look at every single timestamp that he puts. And now I'm gonna like go down through there and answer all of it. What I would say here is, um, yeah, I just don't. I'm curious what your thoughts on the heat problem are. I don't know what that means. Um, I don't believe that. I mean, honestly, I to answer all of those, like that's a lot, and I appreciate it. But and again, what your pastor told you, like again, the idea is that I'm just saying something that somebody told me. That's what these people. That's what is often told to me, and I have to assume that that's what people that you've encountered say. I know I'm all over the place. I'm already an hour and 20 minutes in. Okay. Let me see if I can give at least one answer to Timothy Williams. Um, if it was to show that the words from the speakers were true, then why don't faith healers actually work? Um, so-called faith healers don't work because they aren't from God. I mean, that's the simplest answer there. Um, the miracles, Paul predicted the cessation of miracles and spiritual powers um, of the early church when the complete had come. And that's 1 Corinthians chapter 13, by the way. It's like verse 10, I think. Got a Bible right here. 1 Corinthians 13. Love never fails, but whether there be prophecies, they will fail. Whether there are tongues, they will cease. Where there is knowledge, it will be done away. For we know in part, we prophesy in part. But when that which is perfect is come, that which is in part shall be done away. And so that is this is also another one of those cases where someone is saying here that um they were a former, I'm an atheist, what do you want on your podcast, also a former young earth creationist. Hey, I might have to get you on the podcast. My here's my email, man. Let me. And my thing is this: my email is publicly available. Now I might have to change that, but my email is available. What do you want on your podcast? Uh, so I might have this person on my podcast. He was a former young earth creationist. I'm the difference between an axiom in science and an axiom in religion are so vast that the comparisons between the two are laughable. I don't even know if I even used the term axiom. Maybe I did, but I don't think I was using it in terms of religion. I've got to wind this down. We're at almost an hour and a half. So I'm going to stop here at who's at 2 days? Man, all these people are 3 days. So I'll stop at Timothy Williams 8530. I think we'll start with Henry P. Bell maybe next week. Like I said, we tried to get as many in as we could in about an hour and a half. And so sorry I didn't get to you, but I always start at the bottom and then we kind of skip all of the um, skip a bunch of them that we don't want to talk about. So we'll look to Henry P. Bell and we'll kind of start there next time. But I will just say here, so-called faith healers don't work because they aren't from God. Paul predicted the cessation of miracles and spiritual powers of the early church when the complete, that is the Bible, had come. 1 Corinthians 13, 8 through 10. You can also see this in Ephesians chapter 4. They're kind of like parallel passages. It talks about coming to a unity of the faith and the knowledge of the Son of God. And it talks about how there were apostles and prophets and evangelists and pastors and teachers. And it seems to be talking about these specific offices in the early church. And that once the unity of the faith came, that there would no longer be the need for that. So we don't have apostles anymore. We don't have prophets anymore, despite what people out there are saying. That we don't have that anymore. So these people that are faith healers, they don't work because they aren't from God. Paul predicted that miracles would cease. That let's say it let's say it less, that miracles and power would end when the complete that miraculous, let's say it this way, miraculous spiritual powers of the early church would end when the complete had come. This is in some people's minds, this is controversial. There are people that say they're believers that don't like this. I was actually teaching a Bible class last week, and we'll end on this note. I was teaching a Bible class last week, and I was talking about how there are not miracles in the sense that that we see from Jesus and his apostles and in the early church. And so let me explain what I mean by that. When you look in the scriptures, when you look at the New Testament, when Jesus comes on the scene, he is doing things that had never been seen before and has never been seen since. Examples, we could talk about many of them. His first miracle, he turns water into wine. Not a little bit of water into wine. This isn't a magician's trick. He transforms water into wine. And so, and a great deal of it, by the way, gallons and gallons of it. He also does things like with a word, he is able to still the sea when it had been boisterous and raining and storming and windy. To immediately make the sea calm defies the laws of physics. But when you are the lawgiver of the physics, then you can do that sort of thing. We see him raise the dead. We see him in the book of John call Lazarus from the dead. Now, Lazarus was decomposing. They didn't want to open the tomb because he was rotting and he was beginning to stink. And Jesus raised him from the dead. And then the Lord himself came back from the dead after being crucified. The Romans knew how to do their jobs. They knew how to kill a man, and they killed him. And he came back on the third day. And so we see these kinds of things that they did. We see the miracles of the apostles. There isn't anybody today doing that kind of thing. And there hasn't been a time in history in which it's been easier to demonstrate if you were doing that kind of thing, right? Hey, we all have our smartphones now. If there are people out here that are curing cancer, that are doing the faith healing, as they say, it would be very easy to show this. So someone that brings up faith healers, I'm with you. Those people are charlatans. Those people maybe mean well. I don't know. Some of them are clearly charlatans. You can that they've been found to be purposely misleading people. But I know that there are people that truly believe that they're able to heal. Now, can God heal people today? Can God bring about someone's healing? Absolutely. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a person having the power of God and being able to direct it as they please to heal someone or to do something miraculous like Jesus did. And the point is, we don't see anything like that. We don't see anything like what we see in the New Testament in the first century of the church. And not only that, but when you look through the history of mankind, there weren't many times where this happened. So you can go back to the time of Moses and Joshua, and you saw great miracles happening in abundance. You can look at the time of Elijah and Elisha. There were great miracles happening in abundance. And then you can look at the time of Jesus and his apostles, and there were great miracles in abundance. And you can see at each of those points that God was trying to speak to the people through those men. And so if there are people today saying that they have those kinds of powers, I want to know about it. So if you find those people, hey, let's hear about it. But there's never been a time in history where it was easier to let the world know that these kinds of things are happening. Where are they happening? They aren't. Now, Paul, what we point out here in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 is that Paul said that if there are prophecies, they'll be done away. If there are tongues, they will cease. If there is knowledge, it will be done away. What was he saying? He was speaking to those miraculous spiritual gifts that were there in the first century. He said, we know in part and we prophesy in part, but when that which is perfect is come, that which is in part shall be done away. So what he's saying is that those things were there, the partial things were there because there wasn't the completed scriptures. You didn't have the completed scriptures yet. And when that would come, there would be no need for the parts. And now that we have the completed scriptures, we don't need the parts. How many faith healers do you see saying things that don't line up with the scriptures at all? But they just say, no, believe me. But it doesn't line up with the scriptures. And so I think there are plenty of people that can see that. So that's where we're going to stop today. We need to pick up next time with specifically Henry P. Bell. I need to probably write that down. So Henry P. Bell, if I do want to answer this because this person this person is talking about Bible scholarship, and I mean, I know that there are people that say, "Hey, you have a doctorate in engineering, but that doesn't mean you're a Bible student." Yeah, I'm not telling you that I'm some great Bible scholar per se, but I also will say, okay, if I'm wrong about something, show me where it's wrong. And that's what I'm not seeing a lot of. I'm seeing people going in and saying a lot of different things. That's where we'll end today. We're going to stop it there. We'll pick up next Friday with Henry P. Bell. We do want to answer that. And yeah, so yeah, I don't want to start reading it now, getting into it. So we'll stay tuned for the podcast interview with Craig D. Hutt. It's coming up Sunday morning at 7 a.m. Until next time, we'll see you next time.